After a long and tumultuous development, Skull and Bones has finally been released. Billed as a quadruple-A game from Ubisoft's leadership, the game is a current-gen only release, also with a PC version. With such a protracted development period and the game claiming quadruple-A quality, I was wondering how much truth was there to that claim. So I voluntarily offered to cover this game on console and PC for Digital Foundry, and boy oh boy, I think we have a little mess on our hands here with this game in many ways, and I'm not honestly sure where to begin. I guess I should start with the stuff that I think is good. On my preferred platform of choice, PC, I can report happily at least that Skull and Bones is largely competently put together and does not suffer from the issues that I typically rail against in my videos dedicated to PC versions. There is no intrusive shader compilation stutter, the menus make sense as they should, and they use the good Ubisoft style of design which I typically praise, and you have access to various anti-aliasing modes and much more. So you definitely can appreciate the game on PC in its best light, I would say, above the other versions. On console, a positive thing to report there is that the frame rate targets are really well met in the modes that are offered. Each console's Series S, X, and PS5 offer performance and quality modes. The quality mode is higher resolution and targets 30 FPS, and more on that later, while the performance mode is lower resolution and targets 60 FPS, with more on that later. As I said, all of the modes hit their frame rates really well. 30 FPS, yeah, I have not seen a drop on that mode on any console. It just works perfectly fine. The performance is well maintained there. In the performance mode, same thing more or less. The performance of 60 FPS is held all throughout the gameplay that I've played basically. The only issue I've ever really seen happened on two consoles, the Series S and PlayStation 5. In the Series S performance mode, the initial cutscene introducing St. Anne dropped a few frames, but otherwise running around St. Anne ran pretty well. On the PS5, I saw a similar situation where that opening cutscene going onto St. Anne saw some drops from 60, but there was also some hotspots around the St. Anne area when running around it that could occasionally flare up where you'd see drops below 60. I could not replicate that kind of dropping on the Xbox Series X or S, nor could I find the drops in frame rate in that initial cutscene on Series X as well. Based on my experience on a Ryzen 5 3600 PC with an RTX 2070 Super set to console performance mode like high settings at the same internal resolution and scaling factor, just with DLSS, I found out that the St. Anne's area of the game is very CPU limited. With an unlocked frame rate in the open world and in combat, the game on this PC in these settings was often just completely GPU limited on the RTX 2070 Super, and it was usually between 70 and 100 FPS. But in the St. Anne's area, the average frame rate is around 60, with drops below 60 when moving to certain hotspot areas that would cause erratic frame times. With a VSync cap on, that presents on this PC as a number of dropped frames in succession, much like it does on the PS5 version in those same hotspot areas. So I would assume, depending upon the amount of players there, we can sometimes see a CPU limit coming into play there on the PlayStation 5 version that we are maybe not seeing on the Series X or Series S, for example. It's hard to know for certain, but regardless of that, I would say nearly all of the rest of the game is an easy 60 on all platforms, and mid-range PCs with old CPUs should be completely fine here as well, with reasonable high settings here. When playing the game at its highest settings on PC, I would also like to call out some graphical niceties here. I find the water simulation in the game in general to be really great. The waves as you cruise along in your ship look rather good, and there's some nice spray as waves interact with your boat, as well as some obvious subsurface scattering, which makes the color of the water vary based upon how thick it is when it is being backlit by the sun. I also think the particle system they've developed for near-shore waves is neat. There's a white swarm of particles that interacts with whatever it collides with, and it gives the waves near beaches a more suitably realistic look as they get closer to the sand and rocks. Although the particles do look noticeably low res here and stick out in the otherwise good presentation of this wave effect, but more on that later. Skies also look great, but I think they really should, as this is the Anvil Next engine after all, which has been used in the Assassin's Creed series of games. That engine has had competent volumetric sky rendering for years now. In fact, all of the things that Skull and Bones does visually well tend to be those things that we've seen this engine excel at in the past in other games, like the Assassin's Creed ones, which also have good-looking water simulation and skies. But beyond those visual niceties that I just highlighted, I think that's really about it. Otherwise, I think this game bears a lot of evidence in its visuals of its complicated development history, even on the PC platform where the game can arguably shine the brightest. A really good example of an issue in its visuals is going back to the water again. Now, I do think the wave simulation is pretty great, and I talked about that, but the reflections on the water are not, as they are primarily achieved with screen space reflections, and I think this is a huge issue in a game like this, as so much time is spent over on the water. And quite often due to the camera, there's a lot of intervening objects in front of that water. So SSR is going to break. SSR kind of breaks constantly in this game, leading to reflections disappearing or having holes in them. On lower spec PCs or on consoles targeting 60 FPS, another issue with the SSR comes from the fact that it is low resolution. So on top of reflections disappearing all the time, reflections are very unstable and grainy, causing untold amounts of flicker as the camera moves. It's honestly visually distracting. Series S though is in an entirely different league here, as its water reflections are so low resolution that they are almost unrecognizable as water reflections. This game using SSR and SSR only for such large planar surfaces, which is what the water is, was a pretty bad idea. Arguably it should have been RT reflections, or SSR mixed with some form of projected real-time cube maps, or SSR mixed with planar reflections, which we've also seen in other games. This is an area that was honestly done better in Assassin's Creed Black Flag, which came out in 2013. Skull and Bones started its development off based upon the principles and gameplay ideas established in this game, and I think that shows. Black Flag came out though before physically based rendering had been adapted into Anvil engine, and it shows where the materials and characters in the game have a particular sheen to them that I would consider inferior to the materials as seen in Skull and Bones. But for all that, the water rendering in this game, Black Flag, uses planar reflections, which do not have issues of them disappearing or getting really grainy. And honestly, I think its reflections on water look better as a result. They're a lot more consistent. Due to Skull and Bones' gameplay, the developers really should have considered something more suitable for water reflections that is actually stable. Water's taking up more than 50% of the screen at any one given moment most of the time. And those SSR reflections don't resolve well, especially on console in the performance modes. As I just said, I do think things like physically based rendering make Skull and Bones look better in many aspects than Black Flag, and I think this is kind of intuitively obvious when you look at it. But there are other two standout things that Black Flag does better. One is character animations and the other is asset quality. While Black Flag's decade-old character models have awkward materials and simple geometry, they animate really well, and they showcase different emotions in ways that are more natural than the vintage would imply.
I've seen your face before. You's mates with them pirates down in Nassau.
Shut your f***ing gob or I'll fill it with shots, you hear me?
Edward, is it?
Contrasted with Skull and Bones, there we see superior materials and geometric quality usually on characters, but every character has this weirdly stilted look when they move their mouths and eyes. They show obvious transitions from resting states to movement that are very uncanny. Yes, it is unfair to a degree to perhaps critique a multiplayer game for its cutscene animation quality, but that is what comes with the territory of quadruple-A quality, and this game has a lot of dialogue you have to wade through. In spite of quadruple-A quality, Skull and Bones has arguably worse character animation quality than a title that is 10 years older from the same developers essentially.
I got a French hound sniffing right up my sweaty soul. Get him out of my sight.
Perhaps more damning is the quality of textures in Skull and Bones. A great example is the environments near the beaches in the game. You look at that ground there and you get this level of texture quality. There's a mishmash here of some higher res stuff as well as some rather low resolution textures. If you contrast that with the quality of textures found on beaches in Black Flag, you can see there are much higher resolution there, even though that game is really old. I honestly wonder what's happening here. I want to couple this issue with the fact that sometimes textures do not load properly even on big PCs. Check out these signs here rendering on an RTX 4090. Look at how the text is painfully low resolution. I know it shouldn't look like that, but it does. When you put together the streaming issues, uneven texture quality, and also uneven geometric quality, you have many areas in the game that look a decade old, or worse, if you happen to see a bug or a particularly unfavorable level of detail, which I'll talk about, well, right now. Level of detail is also not that great in this game when it comes to the islands that you'll sail near. Objects pop into view very close to the camera, and you'll often see unflattering bitmap levels being dangerously close to the camera there, where things look really low resolution, really close to the camera. It doesn't really matter if you're in quality or performance mode on console, for example, it'll still look pretty poor. If this game was an early access game on Steam, I would not be pointing out these problems at all. But for a self-proclaimed quadruple-A game targeting current-gen consoles only, and not having the baggage of last gen, it sure doesn't look the part. Another issue is lighting quality. The game has a dynamic time of day, which makes sense, but it is still using last generation lighting techniques. So areas in shadow will look flat. There's only SSAO really giving them hints of darkening and shade. The game does offer up RTX GI in the menu on PC and on the consoles in their quality modes, but I have to bizarrely report that it barely affects lighting quality. Now, in games like The Witcher 3, when it was remastered, it got RTX GI on PC and console, and that dramatically affected the lighting quality in that entire game, no matter where you were. But in Skull and Bones, RTX GI only affects the shading on the ship, and nothing else on screen. So all of the areas on land, or areas in the distance like islands, are completely unaffected by the RTX GI. Just your ship is. And the RTX GI effect on the ship essentially just adds better ambient occlusion. Seriously, look at the difference. This is one of the most bizarrely limited ray tracing implementations I have honestly ever seen. One final thing that I think is bringing every version down is the quality of post-processing and particles. Particle effects can often update only at 30 FPS or even lower, it appears, so the game can look kind of low frame rate at times even if you're using performance mode on consoles or you're targeting a high frame rate on PC. Another issue is one I highlighted earlier, is that particles and post-processing tend to be rendered at quarter screen resolution. If you're in quality mode on the consoles or high res on PC, this isn't a big issue, but when you're in performance mode on console, for example, it is glaringly obvious how low resolution the particles are, and that makes the game's troublesome image quality in those modes even worse. All of the particles look like weird nearest neighbor upscaled low res blobs, and the reason for this on console specifically is actually twofold. Firstly, consoles render internally at very low resolutions in their performance modes. PS5 and Series X render internally at 720p. Yes, the same resolution as Assassin's Creed Black Flag on Xbox 360. Series S runs internally at 540p. So you have this low internal resolution. Then you can couple that with the game using FSR2 from AMD to upscale to 1440p on the big consoles and 1080p on Series S. FSR2 in this game is doing an absolute number on the image quality. I would argue, overall, FSR2 is a massive detriment to this game's image quality, and it is hurting more than it is helping due to how many issues it has. Now, these issues are not specific to this game. Really, FSR2 shows us off in nearly every game, but it's especially egregious here due to the things that are happening on screen. You have a lot of particles all the time, so particle ghosting is nearly everywhere, all the time. You have a lot of individual moving parts of these ships, like people, and the camera spinning, and the waves are moving the ship up and down. So you have a lot of objects always moving on screen, and all of those objects are constantly surrounded by a motion blur that is entirely made out of large pixel edges. This is an issue FSR2 has, but since there's so much movement in this game, you see it all the time. You also have object disocclusion fizzle and massive pixel edges that happen everywhere due to anti-aliasing breaking as soon as things starts moving. In performance mode, the game just never ever looks stable. It doesn't look well anti-aliased, and it doesn't look particularly high res even though it is being up-resed with FSR2. The problem is FSR2 is falling apart completely in motion here. Then you can couple this with the quarter resolution particles. On something like Series S, the resolution of the particles is just a little higher res than your average Super Nintendo game. So while the game is offering genuinely competent performance across the board here, as I talked about earlier, the image quality is really dire in these performance mode. On PC, you have the ability to use DLSS or TAAU with dynamic resolution, which is what other Anvil Next games do, by the way. But here on console, for some reason in these performance mode, they opted for flat resolutions with FSR2 and no DRS, and I don't think it really works at all. This is contrasted with the quality mode, where we see one of the largest image quality disparities I have ever seen this generation. Series X and PS5 run at native 4K, with mine not being able to find any pixel counts below that. So 720p in performance mode internally and native 4K in quality mode. Series S in quality mode runs at native 1080p. Here I don't think the game is using FSR2 in its quality mode for anti-aliasing, and I think it's instead using standard TAA. You will notice this as there's going to be less ghosting in the quality mode, even though it's a lower frame rate. Such as here, where a part of the ship with FSR2 on in performance mode has tons of ghosting on it that is just not there in the game's quality mode, which is presumably using standard TAA. So the image quality is a lot better in the quality mode, but you have to sacrifice it for frame rate, even though that frame rate is very consistent, as I said before. The issue with using quality mode in this game is in the controls, and this is where I will finally talk about the game and how it plays. One thing you have to think about with this game is that you're not actually simulating a character in the traditional sense. In Black Flag, that game that's 10 years old now, you can freely walk about a ship. But in this game, you are the ship. You only become a character on land. Ships in this game control with inertia, and there's wind, and you have large swooping movements. They are not particularly responsive, and that is okay, as they are wind-powered machines, and this is a pirating game after all. This lack of responsiveness also carries over to character movement on land, which has very latency-heavy animation, I would say, with turnings and rotations not always exactly happening with the same speed or vigor as you might expect. So there's kind of an inherent latency in response to all the movement types in this game by default. At 60 FPS, I would say this is tolerable, but at 30 FPS, I found myself often overshooting or understeering, or not accelerating and decelerating as and when I wanted to. It made my piloting of the ship harder, and I think many people will feel this way if they use this 30 FPS mode. So in this game, you kind of have a choice between good image quality with bad controls or very bad image quality with good controls. I don't think those are great choices. As for the game itself, this was another area where I struggled in my times with Skull and Bones. Now, this is purely subjective, but I would have thought this was some sort of merry and exciting pirate adventure. But the game's structure is based actually around fetch questing and pseudo RPG mechanics. As an example, you go from one NPC who gives you a quest to go to another NPC who then sends you on a quest on your boat to get something out in the world, which is some mundane item, and then you bring it back to them to get bonuses for the game's RPG system. You are constantly doing small errands, and I don't think much of it feels very pirate-like. The RPG systems grafted onto this game, I think, are kind of at odds with the game's pirateness. You have all these random items, for example, that exist purely for the purpose to speed up mundane gameplay tasks, the chores you do. So you have this false and inflated progression through item leveling. And then you have this weird crafting and gameplay where your ship is constantly running over items, or you have to tap a button to bring them into your inventory. Or more embarrassingly, there's a harvesting minigame that thematically and visually seems to be from an entirely different genre altogether. My biggest issue with the game in the end is that it fails to communicate the feeling that you are playing as a pirate in its core gameplay. As you are not a pirate, you are a ship. And then you have this disconnected avatar gameplay on land that purely exists almost for cutscenes and for crafting and NPC quest giving. As a result of this disconnect, you don't live out the interesting idea of being a pirate. You are a ship. As a part of that, and you just being a ship, that means you can't do things that pirates would do. Would you like to board another ship and swashbuckle? Well, you can't in this game, because if you try and board another ship, all that happens is you see a procedural cutscene after you hook to the ship, and you get extra loot for having clicked the button, essentially. You don't actually board other ships in this game. You just start cutscenes by clicking a button. There's not much fun to be had in that for someone like me, and I think the reward is numbers go up and you see some sort of scripted cutscene. A lot of the game feels like that. You fulfill some fetch quest and you get a kind of sad looking cutscene. The game has this potential of being a pirate simulator, but you end up doing a lot of chores often, and I generally think it's sometimes built to misrespect player time given how it is structured around these tedious fetch questing. It's even more onerous as your ship has stamina attached to it, so you're limited in how fast you can finish fetch quests. Well, I guess that is until you add more random RPG points to something like stamina meters. On top of this gameplay experience, I also encountered a number of bugs while playing. Some were purely visual, like how in the St. Anne's hub, the ground there rendered once as a purely perfect mirror with the water shader applied, so there was gross levels of specular sheen everywhere and lens flares that were blinding. But other bugs I saw were gameplay showstoppers, like how during the game's tutorial I could not land at the first beach that they make you land on to progress the game. The reason why I couldn't land there is because a button prompt never showed up even though I was hitting the button incessantly to try and land there. As a new player, I had no idea if I was the problem here or the game was, so I tried to ask other players in the game's all chat. But guess what? The chat did not work. In fact, it didn't work any time I played the game on any platform throughout all my play. I only ended up being able to land on the island by rebooting the game. This fixed the issue and the prompt showed up. So I could eventually progress, but it was one of the very first things I could do and it bugged out. I don't think that's a good look. In the end, I think there's some good technical execution here. The PC version is solid in the usual Ubisoft ways. The consoles have good, consistent performance in all of their modes. But at the same time, you've got very inconsistent visuals that are especially inconsistent on the console versions in their performance modes, and I honestly think the gameplay here is much too bogged down in design that seems lifted from other games that have nothing to do with the pirate motif. Nearly 6 years ago, my colleague John Linneman played this game at E3 2018, and that's the footage you're seeing on screen right now. When I watch this footage, I can see a game with a lot of promise actually based upon the high seas combat that he was demoed back then. Obviously a lot has changed since then in 2018, and I think they've padded out the game into a full experience in a way that just doesn't work. At the end of this video, I was kind of asking myself, is this game quadruple-A? And I think you barely need to play the game actually to know that answer. Just watch the game's intro pre-rendered video to find out. In that video, you will see an unspeakable amount of studios in the credits there of those who worked on this game. So I'd imagine the budget is actually there to call this something like quadruple-A. You'll also notice though that this video runs very poorly on all platforms and it drops frames, and it is filled with stutter on top of poor video image quality. Anyway, if you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. Support DF on Patreon to enable more content like this in the future, and of course, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
I normally wouldn't give a nobody like you the steam off my piss on a good day.